Hello. Today I will be discussing the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. My presentation is called Race, Fear, and Injustice: The Incarceration of Japanese Americans During World War II. This topic is important because it shows how fear and racial prejudice can influence government ideas and policies during times of crisis. And even though the United States is founded on principles of freedom and equality for everyone, the experience of Japanese Americans during World War II demonstrates that these rights aren't always protected. So, in this presentation, I will argue that the incarceration of Japanese Americans was driven by racial prejudice and fear rather than legitimate military necessity. So, during World War II, more than 120,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in internment camps across the United States. About 2/3 of these incarcerated were American citizens. Many Americans supported these actions because they feared another attack on after Pearl Harbor. Um, but like historians found like little evidence that Japanese Americans posed a threat to national security. And so that brings up the question, why were so many innocent people stripped of their rights? And did racism influence government policy? So before World War II, Japanese American communities were well established throughout the western United States. Many families owned farms, small businesses, and homes, and despite facing discrimination, they contributed greatly to local economies and communities. Japanese immigrants were known as Issei, while their American born children were called Nisei. Many Nisei consider themselves fully American because they were born and raised in the United States. Yet, even before the war, anti Asian racism limited opportunities for Japanese Americans and stereotypes that would later contribute to their treatment during wartime. So, on December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, killing more than 2,400 Americans, and that brought the United States into World War II. The attack shocked the nation and it created widespread fear. So many Americans worried that additional attacks could happen on the West Coast. Some like Los Angeles was feared that it would be a major location for a next attack if it happened. Unfortunately, this fear quickly turned into suspicion towards all people of Japanese ancestry, regardless of whether they were citizen or had any connection to the Japanese government. Newspapers and politicians also often fueled these fears, creating public support for drastic measures against Japanese Americans. So, in February 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This order gave military officials the authority to remove people from designated military zones. So, although the order did not specifically mention Japanese Americans, it was primarily used against them. Entire communities were forced to leave their homes, businesses, and possessions behind. The government claimed the actions were necessary for national security, but it was really racial prejudice playing a much larger role than actual military concerns. This document served as one of the most important primary sources for understanding how the incarceration began. Forced relocation. So after Executive Order 9066 was issued, Japanese American families were given very little time to prepare. Many had only days to sell their homes, businesses, and personal belongings. And because they were forced to leave so quickly, many families lost valuable properties and savings. Some businesses that had taken years to build were sold for only a fraction of their value. Families were allowed to bring only what they could carry. The relocation process caused significant emotional and financial hardship that would affect many families for decades. So the internment camps were located in remote areas across the country. Families lived in simple wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire fences and guarded by armed soldiers. So these conditions were often uncomfortable. Barracks lacked proper insulation, privacy was limited, and families had to share communal bathrooms and dining facilities. Even though those incarcerated had committed no crimes, they lived under constant supervision. So, photographs taken by Dorothea Lang provide valuable evidence of those conditions and reveal the human impact of government policies in ordinary families. So, racism and public opinion. One of the most important questions historians ask is why Japanese Americans were targeted so heavily, while some German Americans and Italian Americans faced restrictions during the war. They were not incarcerated on the same mass scale. So remember, it's not just the Japanese that the U.S. fought against. In the European side, the axis were Germany and Italy, but they didn't face the same consequences as Japanese did. So many scholars argue that long-standing anti-Asian prejudice played a major role. For decades before the war, Japanese immigrants faced discrimination in housing, employment, and citizenship laws. So wartime fear combined with these existing prejudice, making it easier for Americans to accept policies that violated the rights of Japanese Americans. So these demonstrates how racism can influence public opinion, and public opinion can influence government officials, and that affects what decision making that the U.S. will roll out. So, Korematsu versus the United States. This is a Supreme Court case. So, Fred Korematsu was a Japanese American citizen who refused to comply with the government's removal order. He believed the policy violated his constitutional rights. His case made it to the Supreme Court in 1944. The court ruled in favor of the government, arguing that military necessity justified the exclusion order. This decision remains very controversial in American history because it allowed racial discrimination during wartime. Korematsu's challenge reminds us that constitutional rights can be vulnerable when fear influences political decisions. So, long-term consequences. Even after the camps closed, the effects of incarceration continued. Many families returned home to find their businesses gone and their property lost. The experience also caused lasting emotional trauma. Families had been separated from their communities and treated as potential enemies within, despite their loyalty to the United States. The economic and psychological effect of incarceration were felt for generations and became an important part of Japanese American history and identity. So, government apology and reparations. So, decades later, the United States government officially acknowledged that the incarceration had been wrong. In 1988, Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act, and during Ronald Reagan's presidency, the U.S. government admitted the actions were motivated by wartime hysteria. So the law offered a formal apology and financial compensation to surviving former prisoners. The government concluded that the incarceration was caused by racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and failure of political leadership rather than genuine military necessity. This acknowledgement represents an important step towards justice, even though it can never fully undo the harm that had been done. So, modern consequences. The history of Japanese American incarceration remains relative today with how the political environment is today, with who's president, and how that affects immigration today, especially down in the southern border. So the events of World War II reminds us that protecting civil liberties is especially important during times of uncertainty. They also encourage us to think critically about issues involving race, immigration, and national security. By studying this history, we can better recognize the dangers of prejudice and the importance of defending constitutional rights to all people. And in conclusion, the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II was one of the most significant violations of civil liberties during American history. More than 120,000 people lost their freedom, property, and sense of security because of policies rooted largely in fear and racial prejudice. This history teaches us that democracy requires constant vigilance. When fear is allowed to outweigh justice, even constitutional rights can be threatened. So, remembering the experiences of Japanese Americans help ensure that similar injustices are less likely to occur in the future. Thank you for listening.